Welcome once again to the Tin Dog Podcast. Right, now, for those of you who've been listening to this series from the beginning, you'll be aware that I started an overview of each of the Doctors. This ran until the beginning of the 2007 season on the TV, when I started reviewing those an episode at a time. I thought it was about time that I got back to this. So, this week's episode will be a review of the Fourth Doctor's time, together with next week's episode. Well, not necessarily next week's episode, it depends when it gets broadcast, but the following episode will also be dealing with Tom Baker. The reason is, Tom Baker, his time with the TARDIS, was basically twice as long as any other Doctor on TV. That's one of the reasons why he's so popular with so many fans, because a lot of people, their favourite Doctor is the Doctor they grew up with. Therefore, if he was there a long time, a lot more people grew up with him. He was a lot of people's first Doctor. Obviously after that we'll be then following the 5th Doctor, 6th, 7th, and there will be an 8th Doctor special as well. These are the plans at the moment. So, before I begin, also I just need to say that there's been a few bits of news which surprised me at the moment. Now normally, you know me, I don't really talk about news, but there are two rather exciting things. The first being that Peter Davidson is down to be in the Children in Need special in a multi-Doctor story. Is this true? We just don't know. Does it fit in with, where does it fit in the series? We also don't know. Is Peter Davidson on board the Titanic? I don't think so. This is very exciting, a multi-Doctor story. Obviously it'll be just a 10-minute thing. Probably won't appear on any DVDs. You might have to track it down, but of course this is in November. Whether it happens or not, we'll have to get back to you. The other piece of news is slightly more odd. Now, as we all know, the next season of Doctor Who, rather than Torchwood, rather than Sarah Jane, we can discuss those another time. That's the 2008 season. That is 13 episodes long. There should be a Christmas special, so that'll be 14 stories. That's all in hand. However, the season after that, which is now covered, so that would be 2009, will only be 3 episodes long. Basically 3 movie-length specials. Now we don't know if that means they'll be an hour long, like the Christmas special, an hour and a half long, like the McGann story. Minutes-wise, if they're movie length, hour and a half, possibly, we're not going to get 2 hours, we're really not. They might as well make proper seasons if you're going to have a 2-hour story. That could be impressive. Now, that will probably bring us up to the end of David Tennant's tenure. That would take us into the next season beyond that, season 6, which would be in 2010. Now, the fact that the BBC are investing in this as a plan is wonderful. David Tennant does want to go off and do some acting elsewhere, which in anybody else would be perceived as I really just want to leave. But in Tennant, who is, the biggest Doctor Who fan Doctor before the show, if you see what I mean, before he was in it, then this could bode well. We just don't know. Most actors end up playing the Doctor for 3 years. It's Troughton, McCoy kind of didn't have much of a choice. Baker would have gone on. This is Colin rather than Tom. Tom's the exception. And of course that's what we'll be dealing with this time. So we're going to be looking at season 12 through to, I believe, just consulting my notes here, either season 15 or 16 depending on time. So we left off with Jon Pertwee, whose current companion was Sarah Jane Smith. She'd been with him for a few stories, joining with the Time Warrior, which I believe comes out on DVD either now, actually I suspect last Monday, or in the near future. It's a very good story. Sarah Jane's character is defined quite well, and she does that whole half-swallow scream thing. A lot of people are big Sarah Jane fans, and let's face it, so was Russell T. That's why she came back. So we had Jon Pertwee and Sarah Jane. The actor who played the Master, Roger Delgado, at this point was dead, and we never thought the Master would come back. That was fine, narratively speaking. It was awful from a fan point of view, but from a narrative point of view, we kind of understood. Now, it was predicted that the actor playing the Fourth Doctor would be slightly older, a return to older form, but Tom Baker was hired. However, they had already cast another actor to do the action stunt pieces, similar in many respects to hiring Captain Jack to do the action sequences when they want the Doctor to step back. So the actor Ian Marter had been hired to play Lieutenant Harry Sullivan. I believe we're English, for God's sake, it's Lieutenant. Either way, Dr. Harry Sullivan was part of the crew. He was destined to join. Now, he joined for one season. So, we start with Robot. Robot, the first story of this season. I mean, let's face it, Doctor Who'd been going for 11 years now. People were thinking about it, fading off the air. So we start with a post-regeneration story. Now, notoriously, these are a little bit suspect. This one, I don't know whether it ranks particularly well. I've given it a 7 out of 10, is Robot. Now, for me, as a child, before the era of videotapes and the like, Target novelizations, these were small sort of books of the movie sort of thing, except they were the only way we could get to learn about old Doctor Who stories that were before our time. I was born in 1972, so a story broadcast end of 1974, beginning of 75, I'm not going to remember. And if I did, that would be even a bigger worry. So, Robot, I finally get to see it on video years later. My experience of the story Robot was from Terrance Dicks's novelisation. I really liked the story. A robot goes a bit sentient, but is used by some scientists who want to probably take over the world. Let's face it, it's Doctor Who. Nobody ever wants to do anything smaller. And they use the robot to to get hold of parts for weapons. It's a fairly standard unit story, but it's also got the same plot as King Kong. Now, given that the BBC's budget was nothing, they ended up using the wonderful Barry Letts CSO. Now, CSO stands for Colour Separation Overlay. It's what's known these days as green screen, but then it was blue screen, and you used it via a very specific shade of blue, or in the case of some stories, any shade of blue, which would make things disappear, so you could rescale things. These days, everything would be done on a computer. Computers just weren't up to it in those days. This was a physical effect, a physical electronic effect, if you see what I mean. And it's not great. The robot becomes giant. I mean, let's face it, the novel's actually called The Giant Robot. He only becomes giant in the last sort of bit of the story, sorry. It's worth seeing. You get to see some alternate costumes for a Doctor. It's well worth seeing. I wouldn't disparage it or anything. However, at the end of Robot, the Doctor, Harry and Sarah travel to the Ark in Space. Now, the Ark in Space was one of the first DVD releases to have alternate CGI effects. So you could select to get rid of the, as far as I'm concerned, quite good model work and replace it with some fairly standard computer work. Now, I know this is the days before the new 2005 season came about, so our expectations of Doctor Who electronic, sort of CGI work was never huge. Of course, these days it is. So the DVD of Ark in Space has those options. Now, Ark in Space is one of the first DVD releases, mainly because it's actually classed as one of the classic stories. It's got a lot of influences. There's touches of Alien, there's touches of post-apocalyptic things, but more importantly, this whole season fits together around this one space station, similar in many respects to the 2005 storyline with the Long Game and then coming back to Satellite 5 later. So we've got this large orbiting spaceship in the incredibly distant future, where this space station, for those pedantic people out there, and let's face it, we're Doctor Who fans, pedantic's in our nature. The space station in the future is orbiting Earth, orbiting a ravaged Earth, one that solar flares have apparently, although not in actuality, wiped out a large amount of life. The human race has dispersed. It's kind of around, well, it's before the times where New Earth is set and things like that, but it's heading in that direction. So you've got a burnt out Earth. These people are humans frozen to be thawed out to repopulate the Earth. They have gene banks full of everything. The Doctor is very impressed with the human race. So, unfortunately, an alien that drifts through space called the Wirrn, made surprisingly using bubble wrap and some fiberglass, and looking like a large insect from Quatermass, plants its eggs in people and then wanders around air ducts. And yes, it does sound a lot like Alien. It's not that much like Alien because, like any proper space station, it's very, very well lit. The Doctor, of course, defeats them, the human race survive, and he decides to fix the thing called the transmat. As you remember from other stories, it's basically the thing from Star Trek that lets you go from one place to another. They decide, because they're going to repopulate the Earth in the next story, the one called the Sontaran Experiment, that they will use the transmat, which of course is a little bit faulty, to land on Earth and then populate. Now, the Doctor, Sarah Jane and Harry come down to Earth. This was filmed on, I think, some moors, but also at Wookiee Hall. Or is that Revenge of the... That's Revenge of the Cybermen. I'm getting ahead of myself. I apologise enormously. This is possibly going to be a very long podcast. I apologise. Sontaran Experiment. It's a two-parter because Tom Baker hurt himself during filming. There is a robot that patrols the moors. It's not the best model in the world. However, the Sontarans have returned. Everybody makes the joke about the Sontarans having video phones, and yet they're all clones, so they all look the same. But then again, they are vain clones, so perhaps that's why they do it, so they can distinguish between rank or indeed battle scars. I just don't know. So those two stories are linked together. The Doctor then tries to return to the space station. However, they are intercepted and then are taken to a rather strange, spooky planet, which the late Doctor finds out is Skaro. They've been intercepted by the CIA, not the CIA that Americans are so fond of, or indeed not so fond of, depending on the way your political bread's buttered, but the Celestial Intervention Agency, after who I believe the podcast company is based. The Celestial Intervention Agency are a bunch of Time Lords who think the Daleks really kind of one day could threaten the whole universe. So the Doctor is sent back to the inception of the Daleks, the creation, the Genesis, hence the title, where they could be stopped. As we discussed in last week's podcast, the Daleks aren't stopped, they are delayed, their history is changed. It's a great story, but of course it is one of those stories that was available on LP album, it was available on tape, it was repeated on TV. It's the one that a lot of people have got access to in their minds. Non-Doctor Who fans are what's technically known in the trade as the Not We, which is a reference to something in the Peter Davidson podcast, which we'll get back to. The people who aren't us, they're the ones who know Genesis of the Daleks, they're the ones who know Davros. So, at the end of that story, using a device called the Time Ring, they try and travel back to the space station that they abandoned in the Ark of Space, because that's where the TARDIS is. So they travel back via Time Ring and arrive at the same space station, but at a different point in its history. Again, influences of Satellite 5. You know what I mean. This story is called Revenge of the Cybermen. It's got the Seal of Rassilon, seen later, but no connection whatsoever to the Time Lords. They do look a bit Vogon-like. This one was filmed in Wookiee Hall. There we are, got that one right this time. That's where the gag in The League of Gentlemen comes from, where he says you couldn't get moved down here for Cybermen in the 70s. This is the one that was filmed there. Obviously, Stumpool Cavern's actually in Yorkshire, if it exists at all, and Wookiee Hall is in the south of England. None of these things are important. However, it's quite a good story. Cybermen have been slightly redesigned. Again, their costume isn't fabulous yet. They're still wearing Doc Marten sprayed silver. They've got guns in their heads for no adequately explained. That's going to give you a headache. But it's nice to see the Cybermen back. And that's the end of that season. Let's face it, for a first season, that's a pretty good wrap. You've got the Daleks and the Cybermen all together. I mean, let's face it, only David Tennant's had that. Oh, actually, that's a lie as well. So, that's the end of that season. Into season 13 the following year. We start with one of my favourite stories, Terror of the Zygons. Terror of the Zygons has some shape changes who are creatures so well designed that they're crying out to be brought back with exactly the same design. They look lovely, the sort of orange fetus things. They've recently made a return in one of the BBC books. I would definitely give that a look. Terror of the Zygons has some reasonably good model work for the time. However, it also has some appalling model work at the end. There's dealings. It's the Loch Ness Monster. It's basically Doctor Who and the Loch Ness Monster, which is what the novel was called. Yes, we have discussed whether he's actually called Doctor Who, the Doctor, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's whatever you want it to be. Everyone just thinks he's called the Doctor. Let it go. They were the novels. So, Terror of the Zygons, I would recommend. Planet of the Evil, however, that comes after it, is well respected amongst a lot of people. It's very similar in many plot strands to, say, Forbidden Planet with Robbie the Robot. There's no robot in this, but there is a whole planet that isn't exactly evil, but it doesn't want anything to leave. It's almost sentient. It has creatures from the age. It's basically Doctor Who does Jekyll and Hyde. And unfortunately, that does kind of show it up. But so far, we've had two very, very strong kind of horror-influenced episodes. We then follow on with Pyramids of Mars. Now, Pyramids of Mars, again, very, very good, very, very popular story. This is the one that I believe is watched in the episode Queer as Folk, in episode 1, when he goes home from the club, bored, and he decides to watch that story. You can spot the real Doctor Who fans because they're the ones who go, yes, you're right, that is what he was watching. Pyramids of Mars is one of those episodes that always ranks. People do like it. It's got some not particularly great sets towards the end when they actually get to Mars, but the bits set in the stately home, the plot, the mummies wandering around England, monsters available in the day, the guy out of Grange Hill playing the guy's brother, who died, sadly. Michael shared a month or so ago, which is very sad. He was very popular at conventions. Pyramids of Mars, again, one to recommend. We then follow with Android Invasion. Now, the guy, for those of us of a certain age, will remember a program called Rainbow, and the man called Roy Skelton, who did Zippy and George's voice. Now, he also did a lot of Dalek voice work at various points in his career, and he plays the villain in this piece. This villain, for no adequately explored reason, is a sort of sea monstery looking thing. He looks a bit like one of the Sea Devils, only fat. And he is an android builder, and he's decided to recreate a bit of Earth and then use that to invade. It's a bit convoluted. It doesn't really make sense. It feels a lot like a Prisoner episode. The fact that the story's called The Android Invasion really kind of spoils the fact that there's some androids that you find out eventually who want to invade. Sarah Jane has a very good scene where the Doctor hits her, and you go, good Lord, the Doctor's hitting his companion. But then she falls to the ground, and her face falls off, and you discover she's an android. Good Lord. It is a good story. It's not the best in the world. It is, however, followed by The Brain of Morbius. Oh, how good is that story, despite itself? It's apparently written by Robin Bland. Now, Robin Bland is a pseudonym for a different author. The author was so disappointed by what the script actually came out with looking like that he said, oh, just change my name to Something Bland. And that's what it came up with. Now, whether that story is true or not, it doesn't affect the fact that we all kind of really love the story. It's got the Sisterhood of Khan in it, who are some Gallifreyan witch-type people. Very good. And But, oh, sorry, did I mention that by this point Harry has left? Harry leaves, let me see, in Terror of the Zygons. At the very end of the Zygon story, Harry stays with the Brigadier. Unfortunately, Ian Marter died in, I believe, 1981. I could be wrong on that one. I am going off the top of my head. So I apologise to anyone listening if I have got that wrong. I know I'll receive emails if I have. Where were we? Brain of Morbius. Right. It's basically Doctor Who does Frankenstein. We've had Doctor Who does The Mummy, we've had Doctor Who does lots of other things. This is the Frankenstein story redone. And obviously Frankenstein is the Doctor in that story. He isn't the monster. In this story, the monster is a renegade Time Lord called Mobius. Mobius tried to make the Time Lords more warlike, and he was sentenced to be killed. The only part of him that was survived was, of course, his brain. This other person, Solon, is the actual professor. He's building from parts of crashed spaceship aliens a body to put the brain in. Now, why he couldn't have just got the one body and put the brain straight into it, I wonder, but we never really did figure that one out. Of course, the Doctor's head's fabulous, very large. It's Gallifreyan, so it'll probably not reject the brain. And you know kind of where you want to put the brain. In any other context, this could have been seen as a 50s B-movie kind of a plot. It's not. It's fine. Just accept it. I would definitely recommend you see this story. I know it looks dated, but it's wonderful. It treads that line between overacting and really overacting. And, just go for it. It's great. Phil Magic is superb in this story. Mind you, though, he's always good. So, Brain of Mobius is the second last story of the season, followed by Seeds of Doom. Seeds of Doom has got the Chronoids. Now, the Chronoid alien costume is actually the Claws of Axos alien costume sprayed green. But the story's a six-parter. Now, by this point, the six-parter was kind of on its last legs. People had started preferring the four-part stories. The six-parters were basically made as a two-parter with a narrative link to a four-parter. They put together, they could film the blocks better like that. That's more of a technical thing. You don't really need to know that in a review like this. Seeds of Doom's storyline is very much like the X-Files story Ice, where something is found in the ice, and it's some eggs, some pods, some vegetable matter. Obviously there's an insane megalomaniac genius millionaire. How come they're always mad millionaires? In real life you just get mad poor people. There's not a lot of mad millionaires, hence the reason they're still millionaires. Haven't given them money away. Either way, he's a big fan of plants and things. So, this person, you never establish what he eats. Or is he just a... That's all gone a bit Robert Rankin, hasn't it, if he just eats meat? Crashing on. Am I rambling too much? I suspect I am. This podcast's already recording at 23 minutes plus. Seeds of Doom starts like the X-Files story. We've got the ice base. We've got these pods which are transported back to England at the end for the crossover point between the parts. And we've basically got large alien vegetable, King Kong-like massive growth spurt, makes plants come to life, bit triffity. They try and kill people. It becomes enormous. It's no longer the Chronoid Axon costume thing. It's grown. Unit get called in and they destroy it. Seeds of Doom goes on a bit. It's not one of my favourite stories. It does have Boise from Only Fools and Horses in it. Always worth noticing. Always worth making a note when somebody famous is in another thing. Kind of brings us to the end of Season 13. Onwards to Season 14. Now, you may have noticed there's a sort of gothic horror thing, but that's fine. We've got Mask of the Mandragora. Now, it was one of the latter video releases, and I hadn't seen this for years. I hadn't remembered seeing it at all, and there's kind of a reason. It's not the most enthralling of stories. It's not something I would desperately recommend straight off. However, it is well worth seeing. It has got the feel of, again, one of those 1970s Hammer horror films. I'm sure you're familiar with their work. It's, desolate house, somebody doing some research, they find something from the past lurking. Mask of the Mandragora does have a hole. There were 14 planets in the solar system. One was destroyed by Gallifreyans, that became the asteroid belt. There's a lot of backstory to do with the universe in this story, but it's so throwaway as not really to be gone into. I've just got that completely wrong. What I've done there is described the story Image of Fendal. I am so sorry. That belongs in the next podcast. This one, Mask of the Mandragora, got that same feel, but this one was filmed in Portmeirion. It's set during the Renaissance. It's got some Italians in it. Sarah Jane gets kidnapped. It's one of those things. It does, however, have that moment where Sarah Jane asks the Doctor how come she can speak Italian. It's the first time it's really been dealt with. The Doctor at this point just says it's a gift of the TARDIS. Only later, when Rose, well, actually it's in The End of the World, but you know what I mean, by 2005, it's dealt with on a much better level. Sorry for the mistake there. Hand of Fear marks the end of Sarah Jane's time on board the TARDIS. Hand of Fear, a very nice story. Eldrad must live. Eldrad is a silicon-based life form, again a warlord who was sentenced to death. The only part of him that survived was his hand. His hand is dug up on a quarry. The Doctor materialises on Earth. He thinks it's an alien planet. It looks like a quarry, and then to everyone's surprise, it is a quarry. That is Doctor Who's best in-joke. That's it. It doesn't get better than that. Sarah Jane's final story is very good. Eldrad seems to be a fairly benign radiation-absorbing alien, if such a thing exists at all, and then eventually reverts back to his natural form, and then of course becomes evil once he no longer looks slinky. It's a bit sexist in that sense. I'm seeing it there. Fair enough. Bye bye, Sarah Jane. We'll see you again in School Reunion when we get round to reviewing the newer stories. Or which I will be doing. I will be doing a Ninth Doctor overview, as well as all of the stories I've not done. So, Hand of Fear, very nice. This is the first point, the Deadly Assassin. Can I just ask a question? What sort of assassin isn't deadly? A not particularly good one. This story, The Deadly Assassin, marks Tom Baker's only story by himself. It also has a sort of pre-title written sequence. It just throws you whenever you see this story at the beginning. The Doctor returns to Gallifrey. We get to see all of Gallifrey, and it's a bit like an Oxford quad, and there's a lot of bickering. You aren't exactly disappointed with Gallifrey because the story gallops along, and for a kids' show at the time it was quite nice. However, looking back on it, the Doctor enters a virtual world called the Matrix. I'm not making this up. It is well worth pointing out that many, many people have been influenced in many, many ways and not particularly removed the ideas too much. But let's face it, the idea of a virtual computerized world where anything can happen, and including if you die there, you die in real life, it had been mentioned before, but it is extremely well executed in this one. This is the one where one of the cliffhangers, Tom Baker's Doctor, is being drowned, and Mary Whitehouse complained because that was the image that stayed with kids for a week. Stuff they could get away with then, I don't know if they could get away with now, but similarly the other way around. It's a very, very good story. The Doctor by himself does work. However, in the face of evil, we're presented with a new companion, Leia. Leela, not Leia, Leela. Princess Leia, Star Wars, Leela, fighting maiden of the Sever team. We've got Doctor Who. Lovely. The Face of Evil concerns a story that we've never seen before with the Fourth Doctor in it. The Fourth Doctor had apparently repaired a spaceship computer by copying bits of his mind. Unfortunately, bits of his mind inside a computer kind of made the already sentient computer go a bit mental. It had split personality. It also had the Doctor's face, so when the Doctor arrives on a planet and there's a picture of his own face carved in stone and it's worshipped by the locals and feared by them, that's not a good thing. The spaceship had originally crashed years and years earlier, and the survey team had devolved into a tribe called the Sever team, and the Tesh were the people on board the spaceship, which was now a big tower called the Tech. It's a nicely thought out piece of sci-fi. Of course, that's followed by Robots of Death, one of the first DVD releases, and with good reason. It does everything that Doctor Who does well. Small cast, people chatting, things happening, people not knowing who the murderer is, you having suspicions. It's a murder mystery with some sci-fi elements. It is also heavily influenced by Frank Herbert's Dune. Some of the model shots are wonderful, some of them really aren't. But you have to remember, these are things of their time. This is the past. Don't judge things, don't think they're wobbly sets. These sets do not wobble. They do look good. There are fashion statements, there are fashion mistakes. They're all to be taken on board. The performances are very, very good. So that's the whole 10 Little Indians. Who is it? Oh, it might be someone who's already dead. We just don't know. There are robots on boards. It's nice to note that the robots are called Boks. And one of the wonderful things that there is 3 different types of robots. There are dumbs who can't talk and they just do stuff. There are Boks who do stuff and can talk. And there are super Boks who can do stuff and think for themselves. I like to think that the beer Super Bok was indeed named after these robots, and often order it thinking smugly about Doctor Who. I need to get out more, or possibly even stay in more. Now, I'll do one quick recap of that so far, of what we've got, and then call this episode of the Tin Dog Podcast to a close. The rest of Tom Baker's time will be covered in the next podcast. There's been a lot to go through so far. Just to recap, we started with Sarah Jane, we picked up Harry, we've lost Harry, the Doctor travelled by himself for one story, and we now have Leela. Let's give marks out of 10. Robot, 7 out of 10. It's well worth seeing. Ark in Space, even better, 8 out of 10. Sontaran Experiment used to come in the VHS set with Genesis of the Daleks. Sontaran Experiment, 7. Genesis of the Daleks, 10. If you have not seen this story, you must find it. It is down as one of the best stories ever. Followed by Revenge of the Cybermen. I'd like to give this an 8. It is something I personally like. A lot of people aren't fond of it. I'm giving it a personal 8. Everyone else can give it, I don't know, on the whole, a 7 or possibly a 6 in some cases. Terror of the Zygons, we're on a roll. I'm giving this a 9. Planet of Evil, back down to 7. Pyramids of Mars, a lot of people would give this a 10. I'd still like to give it a 9 because I just don't like bits of the ending. Although the voice of Sutekh, the Destructor, is done by the same guy who did The Devil in the 2006 season. Very, very good. Pyramids of Mars, a 9. Android Invasion, a 7. It has a lovely feel to it, but the fact that you know there's androids coming does spoil it. Brain of Morbius, a 9. Bordering on a 10. Almost a 10. I just don't know why I couldn't give it a 10. I just couldn't. Seeds of Doom, 6. Maybe 7. It's worth seeing just for completeness. It just feels like it goes on a bit. Mask of the Mandragora, 7. Hand of Fear, an 8. Sarah Jane's exit is very good. That could bring it up a whole extra point now that I come to look at these things. The Deadly Assassin, that's an 8, just for the Gallifreyness. You get to learn so much. You get the feel of the whole thing, and of course it is the return of the Master. The Master, I've just spoiled that for you. I'm sorry, but if you don't think these don't contain spoilers, well, I'm sorry. After the Deadly Assassin, Face of Evil, well, it's a 7. It's worth seeing. It does mark Leela beginning. Face of Robots of Death, an 8, perhaps a 9. And followed at the end of the season by the last thing I'll review today, which is the Talons of Wen-Chian. Talons of Wen-Chian, again, a very early DVD release. It's a very good story. It's Doctor Who does Sherlock Holmes. The Doctor, Tom Baker, does get to dress as Sherlock and does a particularly good performance. It's got the Peking Homunculus. It's got lots of things that the League of Gentlemen and other Mark Gatiss, yes, I'm looking at you, Mark, have been, let's put the word this, influenced by and mentioned in various texts and other things that they've been in. Steve Coogan, looking at you. But it's a great story. It is truly lovely. I just think it's well worth recommending. So that brings us to the end of this Tin Dog Podcast. Next time we'll be going from the horror of Fang Rock right up to Logopolis. Be seeing you. You have been listening to the Tin Dog Podcast. If you have been affected by anything discussed in this show, a helpline has definitely not been set up. However, you can email us at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk or leave a comment or a picture at our website www.tin-dog.co.uk. Doctor Who is a registered trademark of the BBC and they'll come round and bite you if you misuse it. No infringement is intended.